this session is going to be recorded, so you will get a notification on your Zoom that says that we are recording. My name is Catherine Grossman, and hopefully you all are here to talk about collecting mid-semester feedback from your students. I'm a graduate assistant with CTRL, and I'm also adjunct faculty in the Department of Public Administration and Policy, and my pronouns are she and her. Shed, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Shed, like the thing in your backyard, and I am a teaching and learning specialist at the CTRL with Catherine, and I go by she or they pronouns. Either is fine.
All right, so before we get started, I just want to go over some overarching guidelines for participation. We understand this is a virtual workshop, so please participate in any way that works for you today. If you have questions or want to share ideas, the chat is a great forum for that. If you are going to speak to the whole group, we just ask that you use the raise hand function before you speak. And as always, be generous with your knowledge and be respectful of others' knowledge. So to kind of get us started and introduce ourselves to each other, we want to know what you're hoping to learn from collecting mid-semester feedback this semester or in the future. So if you could just introduce yourself, maybe your department, and share with us what you're hoping to learn. I can share that I'm a first-time instructor, and so I'm really curious to get information from my students in terms of course content, as well as the structure of the class and how it relates back to learning objectives.
Do you want us to type into the chat?
Yes, that would be great. Thanks for clarifying. Great. Jessica is from the library. We love the library. And you're teaching primarily software-oriented courses. Yeah. We're going to talk about how collecting feedback is a great way to model feedback for your students. And if they're collecting feedback in the future, it's a great exercise for them as well. Cornelia is from the Department of Government, and she's also interested in structural issues, of course. I know a couple people just joined us. We're just introducing ourselves and talking about what we're hoping to learn from collecting mid-semester feedback.
I know for me, there are some concepts that I teach every semester that it's really helpful for me to know if people feel like they understand, that I'm going at the right pace, because if they feel lost on that, then how will we move on with the rest of the semester?
Great, we have a representative from the physics department. Would like to learn how to increase the response rate from students for feedback. We'll talk about that for sure. School of Communications, summer courses, and collecting feedback beyond the end of course SETs. And then in environmental science, interested in learning what are good questions to ask at what point in time and how to use that feedback to restructure. Great. Inconsistent feedback, that's certainly always a concern.
And Hannah makes a great note here that collecting feedback can also help students reflect on their own involvement in the class, like a kind of metacognition. It's an opportunity for them to think about their own learning and ask themselves, like, what could I be doing to have a better experience in the course? That kind of thing. Pass back to you, Catherine.
Yeah. No, Megan just put in the usefulness of class activities so far and adjusting for the second half of term. Great. Well, it's lovely to meet all of you, and thank you for participating and telling us what you are interested in learning more about. So just to go over some of the workshop outcomes, we're hoping that by the end of this workshop, you will have a variety of different sample questions to ask in terms of collecting formative feedback from your students. And we're going to go through a variety of different ways to collect, review, and apply this feedback. And our hope is that by the end of the workshop, you'll be able to create a plan for collecting and integrating mid-semester feedback into your course. So to kind of engage with multiple avenues and address different learning pathways, and also just to assist with note-taking, we have developed a worksheet for this workshop that you can use to follow along. Shed, if you will stick, she has the document in the chat, and that way you're more than welcome to follow along, and we'll be pointing out the different headers and the different sections that we're going to be addressing in each of the slides. Perfect. So you should be able to download the document from the chat, but let us know if you have any issues.
Something that we tried this time with formatting was we annotated this document. So we've got comments in there for you to just think about. Feel free to get rid of them when you use this form for yourself. But in the meantime, those are just some prompts and some tips that will also come up in this workshop as well.
So when you're first starting out, kind of structuring your mid-semester feedback evaluation, it's really important to think about what your overarching goals are. And so the corresponding section on the worksheet that we're going to be talking about here is mid-semester feedback goals. So what are you specifically looking for in terms of feedback? Is it on particular course elements or activities? Is it the course as a whole? You can also address both of those feedback areas. And what kind of feedback are you looking to receive? Is it more concrete, quantitative feedback in terms of what the students are feeling is most effective in the course, or are you looking for more open-ended student impressions of the course? This can be really helpful, especially if this is a new course or it's your first time instructing the course, to just kind of get an idea of what the overarching feelings and opinions of your students are. And very important throughout the entire mid-semester feedback process is making sure that your students feel included, that you're being very transparent about what the purpose and the intent is in terms of applying the mid-semester feedback. You want your students to be excited and engaged in the process. And I know from the chat that engagement has been an issue. So this is one way to improve engagement with your students, is being very clear with them about what the purpose of it is and how it's going to be applied in the course moving forward. So when drafting your survey, it's really important to think about what aspects of the course cannot be changed. In each of our syllabi, we have elements or course objectives that are set in stone. And it can be really helpful for students to let them know what aspects of the course can't be changed, so that they're not frustrated when they say, oh, I don't ever want to do readings again. And you have to say, well, that's not a realistic goal for this course in particular, because it's a literature course. So kind of before conducting the mid-semester feedback, reminding students from your syllabus review what cannot be changed. Also making sure that you're asking questions that are going to elicit specific responses. So that kind of goes back to the overarching goal. Are you wanting specific responses on course activities, or are you wanting more general overarching responses from students? And as we've mentioned, this is a great opportunity to let your students engage in metacognition activity in terms of encouraging them to reflect about their learning process. And this can be helpful also with inconsistent feedback, because sometimes students just have a fundamental misunderstanding about what the course objectives are and how the course activities relate to that. And so kind of giving them the opportunity to really think about, is there frustration about reading that they don't have enough time during the week? So maybe they need some time management advice and things like that. Can be really great opportunity for both the instructor and the students to kind of engage in this reflective activity. And again, just making sure that you're asking questions and you're including students in the process and letting them know that their input is valuable and that their input can have a great impact on their fellow students or students that will take the course in the future. So moving on to in the worksheets under sample survey questions, first we're going to go through some sample Likert scale questions. So these are just kind of examples that you can use that for Likert scale questions. And what's really important with Likert scale questions is two things. The first thing is that you outline and define what the scale is. So if you have a scale from 0 to 5, make sure that you say 0 is the lowest, 5 is the highest. You can define it even further in terms of things like 0 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree, just making sure that you are defining the Likert scale. And the second thing is making sure that you define certain terms for your students. So for example, inclusive learning environment, the third point, instructor creates an inclusive learning environment. We have additional words to define that topic for, to define that concept for the students. So the classroom environment is welcoming and supportive. And like for the volume of course material is appropriate, you could say you spend between 0 and 5 hours a week on course material, something like that, to define what appropriate is for the specific students. And this can be very helpful in getting you more clear feedback from your students about what aspects of the course are valuable and helpful to them. So again, this slide just is reiterating that. Make sure you have shared definitions of terms in the questions. If you are saying what's effective, you define effective, helpful, available, etc. Explaining your scales with Likert questions. And we really recommend a mix of questions for your mid-semester feedback. So having some more open-ended in addition to your scaled questions can be really helpful in gaining a more comprehensive view of what your students are finding helpful and not so helpful in the course. And then on the worksheet and on the slide, we have some sample open-ended questions. The classic 3 that we're familiar with from SCTs and other things is what's one aspect of the course that's working well, one that's not working so well, one aspect that can be changed and how. And this can be very helpful, especially if you're planning to implement your feedback within the same semester, because it really encourages students to kind of par down what specifically they need to be successful moving forward within the semester. You can be a little bit more general if you're not planning to implement the feedback within the semester in terms of how this is going to be helpful for the next iteration of the course. Some other examples include how can the instructor better help you understand the important parts of the class, anything to do differently, pacing, is the pacing of the course working, and specific suggestions for improvement. As well as course materials and assignments. Sometimes we engage with many different ways to get class discussions. We have some on Canvas or we do it in class, kind of gauging with your students what is most effective and helpful for them for their learning. And it's important to note that this changes with every class because you have a different composition of students in every class. And so that's why we really encourage you to collect mid-semester feedback every time you teach a course because it's going to be different every time. So there are a variety of different venues for which you can collect mid-semester feedback through AU, but there's lots of different considerations depending on whether you want to use Qualtrics, Canvas, or paper. So some of those considerations include, do you want this to be anonymous? Do you want this to be partially anonymous? What types of questions do you want to ask? And what's easiest for you as the instructor in order for you to review comments and conduct analysis. Some of these options, you can download reports directly to software, Excel or others. Some of these are going to take a little bit more work to go through the comments on your part. And something that's really helpful for me is to kind of condense this down into a personal statement for the semester. So saying my personal goals for the mid-semester survey this semester are that I want to implement a totally anonymous survey. It's not graded and it's optional. So that's just a good way to kind of ground yourself in what your goals are for collecting mid-semester feedback. So this is a resource from Dartmouth that kind of goes through the different advantages and disadvantages of different survey platforms. So for paper surveys, traditionally you get a good response rate, and there's tons of templates that are available, and this is something that we have become familiar with over the years. But the concern with that is that you do need to input that data into software to do analysis. The students have to be present in class to fill out the survey, and it's not anonymous. So with Canvas, you can conduct your survey, and you can see how many students in your class have filled it out. But it is still anonymous. And Canvas has some analytic capabilities, but not for open text responses. So if you're asking a lot of open-ended, open text questions, it may not be the best platform for you. And it's only somewhat anonymous in that it's recording which students have submitted it and which have not. So if you're looking for a completely anonymous and optional survey, Qualtrics may be your best option. And you can post an anonymous link that all your students can access. So they don't need to be present in the course. They can take it if they're sick or they have to miss class for some reason, they can still take the survey. And there are a ton of excellent analysis tools, and you can download it directly to whichever software you utilize, and you can get a ton of information. You can track it if you want, but as we mentioned with Canvas, that does kind of reduce the anonymity of it. And Qualtrics is completely separate from Canvas, so they don't interact with one another. So that's just something to think about. Okay, so we wanted to model an engagement activity, and we are utilizing Mentimeter here. So we just wanted to check in at the midpoint of this workshop and ask how you plan to administer your survey, your mid-semester feedback survey in your course, and maybe some of your reasons why and your motivations for why you're taking that approach. So you can utilize your phone to take a picture of the QR code, or you can log on to menti.com and input the code, and we will look forward to your responses. And Shed has also put the link in the chat as well.
I can switch over to sharing just for the Menti if that sounds good.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me.
Cool. This is a multiple choice. So if you'd like to share your reasoning, please do in the chat so that we can hear from you. Why did you pick the option that you did? To present. Yeah. All right. So I see we don't have so much interest in paper. That's interesting. Does anyone want to share why they picked a digital option?
Can I speak?
Yeah, please do.
I don't know what's Qualtrics.
Qualtrics is a survey, a website that allows you to make surveys that can be anonymous. Yeah.
Okay. Either way, I wanted to get more honest feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Then paper, sometimes it's harder to read, handwritten.
Great point.
Yeah, and then maybe they might worry about I can identify who there. So then less hearing more prompt, honest feedback.
It's an excellent point. Yeah, we have probably all spent some time trying to read students' handwriting on something, right? So
Yeah, and in the chat, lots of people are mentioning that Canvas is the platform that students are most comfortable with. They're already logging onto it to access course materials. Melissa likes that Qualtrics allows complete anonymity. Hannah brings up a great point that you can ask your students what platform they prefer, and that in Hannah's case, her students preferred Canvas. Cornelia says that it's more environmentally friendly not to use paper. And handwriting is more, and Megan says handwriting is more identifiable, so it's not necessarily anonymous. This also is dependent on the size of your course as well. It can be very difficult to implement a paper survey if you have a large course.
Absolutely. So thank you for sharing that. Like Catherine said, like there's benefits and drawbacks to each one. So sometimes it's good to mix it up. But one of the main things we find is if you give time during class to fill it out, that's going to be really helpful for getting those responses. So whatever modality you choose, that's something to keep in mind. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. Excellent. So from here, let's talk about what you are going to do with what you find in your survey answers. So here are some recommendations we have about approaching student feedback. You can use whatever method is really going to work for you. Something you might like to do is just sort of categorize, right? Kind of group the responses that you get, maybe prioritize certain ones. We can't change everything all at once, right? And I don't think students expect us to either, but to sort of help ourselves make choices, you know, we might say, okay, this is something I see a lot, frequency, right? Or you might go with weight on a certain issue. Maybe only 1 or 2 students mention a specific assignment, but what they said really caught your attention. Maybe they said like, I'm totally confused. You say, okay, the weight of that means I need to address it. It's a priority. Or things like course design versus classroom instruction. Course design is likely to be feedback that you can incorporate next semester, the next time you teach that course. Classroom instruction, you can more immediately make changes to, but as you can see, right, each one has its sort of pros and cons for what you pay attention to. And you can make a list of suggestions, decide what to prioritize. Maybe you say next semester, I'll really look at XYZ, right? Because I'm already looking at a couple things right now. So one way that you can categorize some of this feedback is based on how much you can change. We call this the 3 piles of feedback. So one pile could be what could be changed now? What could be changed immediately? Like changing a deadline on an assignment that's still upcoming or trying this new activity in class. Then you can include things that could be changed for a future semester. And that's usually getting to like the course design level, right? Or a suggestion where it's too late for you to make that change in this semester. So you are going to use it for next semester. And then what isn't changeable? So Catherine mentioned, right, not all of our feedback is going to be useful because or productive, we could say, because some of it might ask about things that can't be changed, like the subject of the course. What isn't changeable? Students will often say like, can we be in a different room? Not realizing instructors don't really have control over that. So this could be a helpful way to sort of work through what might feel like a lot of data. All right. So I don't know about you, but I know I have felt some real anxiety with student feedback, and feel free to chime in if this has been your experience as well. But I've definitely procrastinated looking at my feedback. I've avoided it. I've made someone else look before I would look at it. It can be really overwhelming, right? That's very normal. Getting feedback can be a kind of an anxious moment sometimes, but that's okay. So what are some strategies that we can use? So we always want to acknowledge those positive comments. So just like, that everyone does it, everyone else does it too, or most of us do it, we focus on the negative, right? But it's important to recognize students put in the time to give you the positive feedback that they did share. And it's probably a lot of great stuff. So take a moment to acknowledge, right? I did all these things that students really liked and appreciated. And they wanted to tell me, right? Keep in mind, like we had said, not all feedback will be productive. So sometimes students will suggest things that are, like we said, not changeable, or that are just not particularly helpful. What I always come back to is that I teach gender studies, and a student might say, we focus too much on gender, right? Well, that's not a very productive piece of feedback. Another example I like to give is that the last day of the week for every course I've taught, I've played a fun video on the morning of like the Friday or Thursday, kind of reward them for being there with me. And some students every now and then will say, I don't like the fun video. That's not a very productive piece of feedback for me, right? I don't get it very often. The weight isn't so important. And I don't think it has that much impact on the student learning, right? And then interpret with others. When you interpret by yourself, it can get kind of overwhelming. Maybe we spiral, maybe we start to be like, what does this even say, right? What is this person suggesting? You can work with us. We are very happy to interpret feedback with you and talk through it with you, or you can speak to a peer or a colleague. Just having someone around can be really helpful. All right, we want to acknowledge bias in student feedback because it is a growing conversation, and just short of 100 research studies show that student evaluations become a sort of playground for bias around race and gender, and that instructors who identify as women and instructors who are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, will get severely decreased student evaluations compared to their more privileged counterparts, even if what's being taught is exactly the same. There's been like blind studies and things like that where the students didn't know the gender of the instructor, or the gender was the variation, and for the exact same course gave different feedback based on the gender. So the American Sociological Association released this sort of announcement in 2019 where they talked about how we should be using SCTs and how we could be using them more effectively, keeping this bias in mind. One thing to think about is that SCTs and similar end of semester evaluations are intended for longitudinal reflection, not person-to-person comparison. So the point is not to see who is best among a certain group, but it is to understand how you grow over time. But unfortunately, institutions often compare our scores with others, right, as a means of assessing our effectiveness. So something for you to keep in mind for yourself is that you can be using them for longitudinal reflection. When you're sharing it with others, like in a promotion and tenure file or a job application, you will probably want to combine it with different types of feedback. So the ASA recommends bring in other type evidence of your effectiveness, like mid-semester feedback, right? What we're doing today. And, artifacts, syllabi, observations, peer feedback, right? And then keep in mind the shaping of questions. So how we ask questions can actually help us mitigate some of the bias that students might express. A lot of end of semester feedback will ask questions that you will see can be pretty vague, or say something like, what did you like about the instructor? Right? Which is unfortunately a sort of pipeline for more biased expressions. Whereas asking a question like, did the professor require high levels of performance? And can we define what a high level of performance is so we have a shared understanding, etc. So as you can see, this does not get rid of bias in student feedback, but it shows that mid-semester feedback can be actually very helpful. How we shape it can be helpful in mitigating some of that expression of bias. All right, so we're going to do an exercise here about categorizing feedback to show you all how we might prioritize and look at different evaluations from students. So this is also on the worksheet. So it's under sample student feedback. You'll see a table. And here we go. And what I'm going to do is just give you a couple minutes to read this. And it's also on the worksheet in case you want to zoom in or highlight or underline or whatever. And let's see if you can pull out what are some of those themes that come out. What patterns do you see? Or what do you notice from looking at this feedback? Catherine, how long should we take?
Let's do a couple of minutes just so we can make sure to get to the rest of the content.
Cool. I'll check in after 2 minutes.
And feel free to throw any thoughts you have into the chat or unmute and share with the group.
All right, would we like another minute?
I'm not sure what you mean by theme. I mean, I see that like one student wrote a lot and one student wrote less, but I'm not sure what the question you're asking is.
So the question is, what kinds of requests are students making, or what are they pointing out that we can see commonalities, as these are 9 different responses? All right, so let's talk through it together. So what did we notice? What stuck out to us? What did we observe when looking over this feedback? All right, so we've got some stuff in the chat. Lectures are working, absolutely. Students seem to really like the lectures. Timing and scheduling came up a lot. A positive theme of appreciating the materials covered. Well said. Yeah, a constructive theme of wanting access to review materials. Yeah, so students are asking for more guidance and feedback. Yeah, so it sounds like, and I like that sort of timing and scheduling, absolutely. So what do you notice, Catherine?
Well, I think that the initial comment really points out that there's a diversity, but there's 9 different responses.
Yeah.
So, we've been talking a lot about how this process can sometimes be overwhelming, and that's why the kind of brainstorming, goal setting, prioritization can be really helpful for you as an instructor, so that going in that I want to focus on time and structure. And then you can kind of prioritize those comments versus other comments that you may have less priority to attend to this semester, but want to for future semesters. And so there's still value in collecting that feedback, but maybe it's not going to be implemented as quickly.
I like how you said that. Yeah, exactly. Well said. If we can look at our next slide, we did some highlighting to demonstrate some of the themes that we caught. So like folks said, the lectures, the presentations, students really like them, right? Which is really great. And the colors don't mean anything. These are just different colors. Feedback. So we see 2 comments asking for grades to be given back a little more quickly for the students so that they know they can improve because it sounds like it's a recurring assignment or set of assignments they're doing. In green, we've got review and reviewing the material, which came up. So that's something for the instructor to keep in mind that it came up so much. But then we only have 1 comment about the issue of timing with the project. It's in blue. Also, my project is taking up so much time and I'm unsure which direction it is going. That's only 1 comment, but that person might be a little distressed, right? It might be good to ask the class, even though 1 person brought it up, you could ask the class, do folks feel like you know where you're going with the project, or to give an opportunity for students to like turn in a draft or talk to you about what their idea is for a second to get approval on it. And if you check in with students, you might find, oh, actually a lot of people were worried about that. Or maybe it's just a couple people and you can say, okay, if you have questions, come talk to me, or let me just review the assignment 1 more time. Something like that. So frequency, weight, right? We have different sorts of responses here that we can work with. I know some instructors who will say, okay, every time I see a comment asking for, more directions, I'm going to code it. And then they code all of their feedback and they see what comes up the most. And the things that come up the most are what they address, right? So that's 1 method, depending on how you think and how you tend to categorize things. So we get a good idea of what these students are asking for and what they like, which is great. All right, and then we get to after, right? How do you debrief with students after you've gotten their feedback? So a quick note, some things to think about before you talk to them when you're planning. Exactly what are you going to change? Exactly what are you not going to change, right? And what will be reconsidered? How will the feedback be discussed with the class? So how do you want to talk to them about it? You could just take a few minutes at the beginning of the next class, thank them for their feedback, tell them about, what's going to change and what's not going to change, and explain why. Will students get to share future feedback with you besides just the SETs? And remember that you don't have to change everything all at once. You can pick your highest priority changes and keep other ones in mind for the future. Students, don't need the entire course to change or anything like that. And they will likely appreciate any change that you make at all based on what they asked for. So when we are debriefing, of course, we want to thank our students for taking the time to share feedback with us. That is huge. It helps us improve, and it can help their learning too, as we noted. And of course, again, acknowledge the positives. If you go back to your students and you jump straight into the negatives, how will that leave them feeling, right? They might be like, well, I wrote all that nice stuff and they totally skipped over it, right? Why'd I even bother? So acknowledge those positives, and that is going to be really important for that connection with students, opening up that communication. And feel free to ask some follow-up questions, right? And say like, okay, some people said this, some people said this. Can anyone explain why they thought that? Or can you ask questions now that you feel like, you need clarification on? And then you can summarize the feedback and what changes you're going to be implementing. So if you can advance, Catherine, you can go back to these 3 piles. You can say to your students, here's one thing I'm changing now. Here's something I'm going to change for next semester. And here's something that I can't change, and here's why, to explain to students, right? And again, what's really powerful about this process is that you can, that it opens up that communication. It offers an opportunity to communicate more effectively with your students. So that's why you can let it become like a conversation. You can ask questions, they can ask questions. That's what allows students, right, to feel more open with you in the future. All right, so we are getting to our final reflection here. And in the chat, we want to hear, after this workshop, how do you plan to incorporate mid-semester feedback into your course? So Do you have a particular plan? Maybe you're going to use a digital platform to ask them 3 questions, or use Likert scales, or anything else. Catherine, what would you add here?
Yeah, we just really want to empower you and hopefully help workshop any challenges that you anticipate with implementing your mid-semester feedback plan, and just really want you to leave this workshop with a clear pathway forward for mid-semester feedback collection. Okay, we have a question in the chat about what format naturally leads to more constructive comments. Shed, do you want to respond?
I would say it depends on how you construe constructive. I would say, but open-ended questions that invite detail are probably going to give you the most information to work with. If you are using a Likert scale, like Catherine was saying, if you ask students like, how effective is this? And they give you a 4 and not a 5, you might want to make a space to say, and why, right? Because you may not know what to do with that 4 out of 5. Why is it not a 5 out of 5? Questions that are very specific, as we said, like really shaped about specific aspects of the course, that ask students to explain their reasoning, and that probably give students maybe some examples. If you give students examples of the type of feedback that would be helpful for you, or the types of assignments you would like feedback on, that will probably help them. I love that. Yeah. Checking in. Oh, and I wanted to speak to the issue of inconsistent feedback, but I'll let folks share a few more plans in the chat first.
Yeah, Melissa brings up a great point in that it's perfectly okay to discuss this in the debrief with your students after the mid-semester feedback. Again, that's not going to be an anonymous response. And so you may have some issues with response rate or people, but you could also even do a follow-up survey if there was one specific element that was consistent from your students that you think needs to be addressed, and you need more information. This is a great way to go about it. And just constantly checking in with your students to see how you can best serve their learning.
So I would love to see more plans in the chat if anyone wants to share them. But I want to make a note about this issue that comes up of inconsistent feedback, and then I want to answer this. This is a question in the chat. When we get the feedback, like some students say the pace is too fast and some say the pace is too slow, right? So this is where it could be helpful to ask those clarifying questions with students, maybe like what unit went too quickly, or when, right? Like what points, like what portion of it was it when I explained this or that, or is it all of the pacing of all of this, right? So asking really specific questions can help with that, but also asking those clarifying questions with them. And then keeping in mind, students are they're not one hive mind, right? So different people need different things, and different people are going to say different things. So in one semester, your pace might be too fast for some people, but also too slow for some students. In which case it's helpful to be a little flexible and have some different options in the class. So having, some students say more discussion, less discussion, then giving students different, some classes will not have so much discussion, others will, right? Kind of mixing it up, giving students different ways to participate in discussion in case some of them are not finding speaking aloud helpful. Maybe they appreciate filling out a survey or a small group discussion, right? So building options and can help with that. And then if you find that, some students in your course feel really advanced compared to others, then draw on that expertise, let those students teach their classmates. For a hypothetical, students want a change that I don't believe will make their learning better. How do I defend my decision? That's a good question. Catherine, what comes to mind for you?
I think that this is why the goal setting and the being transparent with students about what can and cannot be changed is helpful. It will reduce the number of comments that you'll get, like, I don't want to do readings anymore, or I don't like the classroom, or I don't like the time that the class is offered, things like that. So hopefully that will reduce the number of inconsistencies or conflicting information that you're getting from your students. But at the end of the day, you're the course instructor, and you can just explain to the students that you've designed this course and that these assignments connect to these course objectives. I think sometimes students' discomfort or misunderstanding of assignments is really what the core of the issue is. And so just kind of clarifying. And an additional point that I was going to point out to Shed's comments is that if you are doing a debrief or a second survey, that something that we implement for our mid-semester feedback services is to do individual responses and then small group discussion as well. And that can sometimes make students feel more comfortable sharing additional feedback in the classroom, whereas they may not be as comfortable sharing their individual opinions.
Absolutely. And I would also say, I guess I would think about, like, do you have evidence that maybe you could bring to them to explain why you're making the choice you are? So, for example, maybe like some different research could support you, but I would be careful with that because like any other field, the research and educational development can be contentious, right? So for a long time, a lot of instructors banned technology from classrooms because citing research that says that writing by hand is more effective for the retention of information, but there's actually a lot of studies that push back against that. So something to think about is, like, can you point them to, the logic that you're using, or back to some disciplinary values that might be helpful, that they're grounded in? And if you want to share more, please do.
Can I just
Yeah,
clarify
please.
not clarify, but just add to what I was asking? I think this is like my worst case scenario is that what I was thinking of was very specific, that my classes are very discussion based. And I just, as a person, hate somebody lecturing at me. I hated that as a student. And so I've tried like not to do that at all in my classroom. And so my worst case scenario is if they say, like, we would like more lecturing and you telling us stuff instead of like having this back and forth. And I just, as a personal preference, don't want to do it. Right? Like, I feel like that is, well, I think that's unproductive, because like we want to all share and like have an actual conversation about the topic, instead of just me telling them, here's what the literature says, here's the research, and I'm just like piling it onto them and then I'm moving on. And so this is what I was thinking of, like, I just don't believe that. And also as a personal preference, I hate that style.
Have students ever given you that feedback?
No, I'm just thinking of
just
hypothetical. I just thought of the worst thing that I'll have to change the entire structure of the class.
I think that's how I felt when I had a couple over the course of many years say, I don't like the fun video. And I was like, well, well, I like the fun video, right? But I think, it's students usually get really excited, to be involved in that, engaged in the active learning. If students did ask you for more lecture, I think that'd be a good opportunity to ask them why. And the answer may reveal that it's not actually more lecture that they need. It's something like clearer directions about something, or that they just really enjoy like the delivery of information that you offer, or something like that. So if they did say that, I would say, like, ask some questions and see what's the need that is like not quite being filled, or what are they confused about. And then you could also point out to them that active learning, I mean, this is one of the things that educational research is like very solid on, is that active learning is effective for the retention of information. So getting them involved and not just lecturing at them is really important for their learning.
And
Thank you, I
Cornelia,
appreciate that.
I think you can also just be transparent, open, and honest with your students before you
Yeah.
give the survey and say, it is my personal preference not to have lecture-based classes. For all these reasons. And that's not an aspect of the course that's going to change. And that way you're not going to get that response from students because they know it's not going to change. And so that might be one way to approach the worst case scenario, which hopefully never happens. I just want to acknowledge that Megan shared their strategy for their class in terms of separating, having different surveys for student experience, and then also doing self-assessment of their work within the class. But I believe we have a raised hand, so I want to give that person the opportunity to speak.
Hi, can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Okay, hi. So just to give you some examples from the SETs last semester, I had responses like the few students actually. Some of them, they said that the homework and the exam, there's a huge difference between the homework and the exam. So I have this comment, and right below that, there is another comment that says completely the opposite claim of that the exam was exactly like homework. Okay, so then I don't know what to do with those kinds of comments. So at this point, I really don't see any use of those comments from SET. For every comment, I have the exactly opposite comment by another student. Okay, so another issue, my main issue about SETs is that I do not see a large response rate, mainly because through the semester I asked for the feedback. I asked for the feedback from this students, and I was so flexible that I implemented many of those in the course. But at the end, most of the students, majority of the students, are okay with the course now, so they do not fill in the surveys at all because they are okay. They don't have anything to complain, but perhaps the positive feedback is missing. I'm not sure if that was clear about my issue. So if we can talk about the increasing the response rate as well, that would be appreciated.
And just to clarify, you're talking about the end of course SET?
Yes,
response rate?
because
Okay.
through the semester all the time. So I had a, let's say, dynamic feedback receiving mechanism in the course, so that was okay. But at the end, most of the students were clear, and I think they were happy because it was flexible and all of the feedback received during the semester was taken care of. But at the end, they did not feel like filling in the end of the semester survey at all. So because they were okay, they didn't have anything to complain. Just a few students who wanted to complain, they did. So
Right.
just 2 or 3 students out of, let's say, 60 students.
Right. Yeah. Well, two things to acknowledge. The first is that SET response rates are always low. In fact, across American, there are many courses that the responses don't even get recorded because they only receive 1 or 2 responses from students out of a class of 60. So your experience and with SETs is not atypical. But the second thing that I want to highlight is that you have the artifacts, you have the evidence from collecting feedback throughout the course in order to say the majority of my students are, so you can make that claim that the majority of my students are happy with the structure, with the format of assignments. And so as opposed to your fellow instructors who may not collect mid-semester feedback and don't hear anything from SETs because of low response rates, you have extra evidence and responses from your students throughout the course. So I think that's fantastic. But I understand there is survey fatigue as well. And your students may have felt that they expressed their thoughts and opinions throughout the course and they don't feel like they need to fill out the SET. But in terms of the SET being a critical artifact, I don't think that it necessarily is. And there's certainly tons of people that don't get SET responses at all.
Thank you. That was very helpful. But just one quick question:
Yeah.
Are we allowed to assign some small credit for filling in the surveys? Can
No.
we just
Yeah,
nothing
I think you
allowed?
can. Yeah, I
The
think
re-
Or
that's-
maybe can we say that if I receive, let's say, I don't know, 80% responses, I will add some small grade to everyone, a small credit for everyone. It's not just individual, but to the whole team.
The reason we wouldn't recommend that is because it would be kind of like paying the students to write, because it skews
Yes.
the
Yeah,
feedback. And if students just want to do it to get the credit, they'll likely just fill it out in a very minimal, unhelpful way, right? So as Hannah points out in the chat, and as we mentioned earlier, just giving them time. In the last week or two of class, just say, I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Take out, usually students bring laptops with them or phones, and you don't require them, right? We can't make them do it, but you could say, I'm asking you, please take these 5 to 10 minutes to fill it out. And then, right, you will get really great response rates from that. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to the inconsistent feedback is maybe to change the question. So write a question like, what feedback do you have, or what's something that could be changed might be too vague. Instead, you might say something like, how can the test be improved? Or just bring that to class, right? Point out to your students, say, some of you pointed out to me that the test and the homework feel too similar. And then some people said that the homework and the exam are too different. So can someone tell me, can I get a thought from someone who said they were too similar and a thought from someone who said that they were too different? And can we, and you can explain to students, from my point of view, you can understand how I have this really contrasting feedback. What ideas do we have as a group? So kind of asking them to brainstorm with you. And another thing that's helpful with getting that higher response rate would be to frame it to students as being really important, right? To say to them, here's how SETs are used. Students often don't fill them out because they don't think anyone reads them, right? So say to them, I read them, I'm going to spend time on them, I'm going to review them with XYZ, this person, they go into my teaching portfolio. I mean, I wouldn't just say they go into my portfolio and I'll get in trouble if they're bad, but, not that deficit framing, but rather they can be extremely helpful, and maybe even give an example of a time that you incorporated feedback. So you could say, last semester, students asked me to do XYZ, and I integrated it, and it sounds like you all really like that this semester, right? And again, one way to that can help improve SETs and improve the response rate on them too, is to do the mid-semester feedback, because it shows that you care before the semester is over. If students don't feel like anyone cares about their feedback, then why fill it out, right? But if you show you care at the halfway point, they're more likely to respond to any survey.
Great. I just want to point out that Victoria put a link to a survey. So we're looking for feedback as well about what aspects of the workshop were helpful and what you would like to see changed in the future. And so please take a moment to fill out that Qualtrics form. And I'm just being mindful of time. It is 2:00. I'd like to thank everyone, and we will stick around if anyone has any additional questions or clarifications that we need.